Okay, so welcome to C1, Species and Communities. In this video, we're going to just be basically talking about tolerance, range, and distribution of species. So questions 1 through 6 and the questions to consider. So we'll be looking at, some important terms like habitat and limiting factor. We're going to look at some examples of tolerance limits and limiting factors for plant and animal species. And then we're going to look at how we could measure, how we can actually graph and how we can measure the species distribution along some sort of environmental gradient. Okay, so let's take a look at our PowerPoint. And first, we'll just start with an important definition, habitat. So an organism's habitat is the physical place or environment in which it lives. Okay, so different organisms have different habitats in which they have evolved to be adapted to. So some species are going to be able to live in some areas that other ones might not be able to. So they have different sets of requirements that they need. So this lichen can handle living on a bare rock without any soil, where a lot of other lichens might not be able to, or some plants. You see this frog likes a freshwater pond, where some frogs might actually be more adapted to a stream and colder water, or whatever that may be. But the habitat is the physical place or environment in which it lives. We're going to take a look at the term niche a little bit later on. Okay, so what do species get out of their habitat? Well, there's a lot of things. This list is kind of, general to plant and animals, food and water sources, but if you're an animal, you're going to find your mating sites and nesting sites, predator avoidance, places, you need to be able to avoid predators in your habitat. You need some sort of shelter from climatic extremes. If you're a plant, you probably need certain nutrients that you're getting out of the soil. But in general, the organism might or might not have adaptations to exploit everything in its habitat fully. So it might be living in its optimal habitat where it can exploit everything, or it might be living on the ranges where some of those things might not be as perfect as they should be. So that's how we start looking at their distribution, and we're going to take a look at some graphs about what that might look like here in a second. But here is an important definition, limiting factor. So limiting factor is whichever factor that an organism would need to survive in a certain habitat that is the most scarce in relation to what it needs. So if you're a plant living in a place and you need quite a bit of water and you're not quite getting all the water you need, that water would be the limiting factor. If you're a plant that needs a particular amount of nutrients to be able to grow and thrive, but you're living in a marginal nutrient zone, then those nutrients, nitrates, phosphates, whatever it may be the limiting factor. If you are a woodpecker living in the forest, if there's not enough nesting sites for you to find, holes in trees for you to be able to find a place to live, those nesting sites, those cavities in the trees would be the limiting factor. So it's whichever one is the most scarce in relationship to the organism's needs. Limiting factors for both plants and animals will often include temperature, water, light, salinity. There's a number of different things that might be here, but you'll see temperature and water are going to be a really big deal for a lot of them. Plants in particular, light will for sure be a limiting factor if there's not enough of it. Soil pH could be. Some plants prefer to live in a higher pH soil. Some prefer more acidic soils. And then nutrient availability, are there the appropriate amount of nitrates and phosphates available? For animals, you're going to additionally need breeding sites, a food supply, and some sort of territory if you're a territorial species. So these are all things that if they are not meeting the requirements, then those could be the particular limiting factor, whichever one's the most stress on whether they live there or not. Okay. This is a graph that I'd like you to get to know. This is a graph showing the law of tolerance. And essentially on the x-axis here, the y-axis, you've got the number of organisms. So the higher up here, the more organisms there are. And on the x-axis, you're going to have some sort of environmental gradient. So it could be, and this is essentially showing the tolerance range then. And so if you've got the environmental gradient, let's say it's a pH, right, for a plant. Maybe this is showing a pH of 6. All right, so you can tell that that would be the optimal pH. It kind of looks like an enzyme graph, doesn't it? This would be the optimal pH for this plant. And as you move to more acidic, then it's, reaching a place where it would be stressed. This is going to be some sort of limiting factor now in the pH, and then you probably wouldn't find them at the lowest pHs. Same here, as it's becoming more alkaline, you're finding fewer and fewer plants until finally you won't see them anymore because it's become too alkaline. So you can actually look at, the number of organisms. This for plants, it could be biomass, and graph that along here. It actually makes a really good investigation. So if you can grow plants with a whole bunch of different pHs, a whole bunch of different salinities, different amounts of nutrients, you can take their biomass after a certain period of time. So if you plant the seeds and you grow them in like 5 different treatments from, it could be acidic to alkaline, and then after a certain growing period, you take them out, you dry them, and take the biomass, and you'll be able to see where they have the most biomass would probably be their preferred pH. You can do this too with temperature. You can maybe see that underneath the tool, but you can put things in different temperatures, and again see where you find either the most biomass of its plants, or then if you were doing a measurement of the number of organisms you find. So you've got an optimal range, you've got what's a tolerance range, but they might be stressed on either end, and then finally a range where you're not going to actually see them anymore. You need to be able to look at the distribution of one animal and one plant species, but I just kind of want to show you some typical, kind of examples of what a graph might look like. So this is a black stripe top minnow, and this is just showing, let's say this is oxygen levels, so low to high oxygen, and there's no numbers on this one, and you should actually see numbers on it, but you can see this is where you would say is their optimal oxygen level, and then here is where that's too high or too low based on the number of individuals, and this is what they can tolerate, right? You see there's their zone of tolerance from here to here. And if you were to ask to compare that to, say, this black-tailed shiner, then you can see that they have maybe a pretty similar optimal, but they have a much more narrow range of tolerance. So if you were asked to compare 2 species, you would want to say, okay, this is the optimal of this one, this is the optimal of this one. Maybe this one's greater than that one, or the other way around. But then you would also want to compare their range of tolerance. And you can see that this is a much more narrow range of tolerance for the black-tailed shiner than it is for the black-striped minnow. I think you should be able to come up with an example. And I just Googled a couple of different things. This is a cool tolerance of a steelhead trout. And so you can see from 13 to 21 is their general tolerance for temperature. And you can kind of see where they have their zones of stress. Up to 25, you're probably not going to see it anymore if the water gets that warm. And if it gets below 9, you might not see it as well. So they're limited by the temperature of the water. Randomly, I just Googled temperature range, optimal temperature bananas, and I found this chart. And I'm sure you could imagine you could graph that as well. So you're probably going to find in the optimal mean, if you were to grow a bunch of bananas, you'd find the most biomass here. At this optimal would be the highest, and then fewer and fewer, less biomass as you move up towards 47. You wouldn't see them, and down to 0, you're probably not going to see them either. Okay, so you can Google any example you want. This is just some general guidelines. Here's another just example from your book. It's kind of interesting. And so would you be able to suggest the optimal range and zones of stress for the cattail by looking at this graph? Go ahead and take a minute to do it. All right. So this, you can see here, we've got this is transplants without competition, ash-free, dry weight in a tub, and here's the water depth. So this is essentially just showing you the amount, right? The biomass or whatever it may be. And then here's the depth from -20 up to 70. And so you can see that's kind of their zone of tolerance. They can survive. You could still find them at a depth of -20 and then up above the water line up to maybe 70 centimeters. And then, but their optimal is probably somewhere in here. They obviously need some more measurements, but maybe it's at like 25, just above the depth of the water, right? Here, Here's another example. Something you might need to do with this is suggest the optimal range and zones of stress for these two species. So you can see on the x-axis we have our salinity, and then the shoot dry mass of the sea blight and the saltwater cress. So would you be able to say, oh yeah, they've got a pretty similar optimal, but it looks like the tolerance range is a bit wider for the sea blight. But then again, maybe they haven't taken measurements over here, so you never know. Okay, so now this is another way you can visualize tolerance ranges, or at least where species exist. If you're going out in the field, you can run what's called a transect and use quadrats, and every meter or a couple meters, you would count the number of species or the density within that range. So this is showing you a transect that was run between at the low tide mark all the way up. So this is where, like, the low tide, if the tide is all the way out at the beach. And so you start there and you run a transect up the beach, up to the beach from there. So right here is probably going to be basically covered in water all the time because this is lowest tide. But then when you get to the higher tide, it's going to be less and less water. So if you were to run a transect, and every meter you would take a measurement of the density, you'd obviously run multiple transects and count the number and get the density at each distance, then you could see for these three species how many of them are found. So the width of the line is showing that it's more dense. So number of individuals. So here from 0 to 10, which is about right here. So it looks like at this point, species B at 2 meters would have about 10 individuals, where maybe this is 7, you know. Okay, so now take a look at this graph. I want you to take a minute. You can hit pause and look at it and see, can you talk about their zones of tolerance? Now, right off, you might say, okay, the zone of tolerance for species B is maybe from 1 meter to 7 meters above high tide. And maybe the optimal would be about 2 meters, right? So this is just a different way to graph the data. Now, looking at species A, maybe their zone of tolerance is, 4.5 all the way up to 7 or 8, right? And it looks like their optimal would be around 5. But what I like about this graph is you can really visualize when species exist in certain places, because species C, you see, exists here and here. And I wonder if you can guess what's going on, why it disappears here. I'm hoping you're thinking, oh, maybe there's some competition here, and species B is using some of the same resources, so species C is not as good of a competitor. We're going to look at this in more detail in our next class when we start looking at competition and the exclusion principle. Okay, so I'm just going to show you one more example of a kite graph. This one is showing a transect that was run all the way from this upper area through a shallow rock pool and then up to into a ledge. And I'm not sure if that ledge goes off into the sea or what that means specifically. But again, the width of the line is how many species you're going to find. It's the most abundant with a wider line and least abundant if it's a really thin one. And so they looked at tons of different species here. And you can see, like, this species here, this Sargassum muticum, is probably going to exist mostly in the water here, right? And it's very abundant. Whereas this first species here, it's going to be way up from not even in the sandy area, right? So you're going to see this one just existing here. And so someone ran a transect and was looking at all the species along that transect and where they existed from here to here. So if you feel like you're comfortable with reading one of these graphs, then you should be good to go. All right, I'm going to stop it here.